Hello, everyone. This is Philosophy 67, Political Philosophy, and we are moving closer to the end of the semester. This is week 10. But just to again see what we have done so far, right? I mean, we began the first part of the class 4 weeks on the theme of sovereign power and dialectical subversions, right? We started with Hobbes, Leviathan, we went into Carl Smith, right? Two books, The Concept of the Political and Political Theology. Then we did Hegel's Dialectic of Master and Slave, and then Marx, especially on alienated or estranged labor, and also the passage about private property and communism. And then, say, part two of the class, 4 weeks again, capture and lines of flight, that was the theme, and then also the prison and the camp. We saw the question of feminism, class and gender, women's work with Dalla Costa and James, and then colonialism and Federici as well. And then colonialism, decolonization with Franz Fanon, especially, but also Walter Rodney, right? How Europe underdeveloped Africa, and Thomas Sankara, right? And then we saw the question of slavery and the prison, right? The prison extended to society. We read Davis, right? Angela Davis and Michel Foucault. We focused especially on Michel Foucault from Discipline and Punish. We going back briefly to Michel Foucault today, a different work by him. And then week 8, we did, sorry, biopolitics, right? The question of biopolitics, life and bare life, the camp, right? We went from the prison to the camp as the political, the biopolitical paradigm of modernity. We also touched briefly on the question of migration, right? And then we started the third and final part of the class, 4 weeks. Now this is week 10. We had 2 weeks left. Last week we saw Heidegger, right, from the essay called the question concerning technology, especially the concepts of enframing, right, and the danger. So today we speak about the threshold, okay, the concept of a threshold. We are reading sections from this recent book by Stavros Stavridis. You have a different edition, but in any case, that's right towards the city of thresholds. And also, I'll touch briefly on Foucault, an essay called of other spaces, right? Utopia, right? Utopias and heterotopias, about which Stavridis also speaks, right? Stavridis, an architect, as far as I know, from Greece. Foucault, we already spoke briefly when we did Discipline and Punish. But in any case, what I want to touch on, is the concept of threshold. Think about that and build on this. I mean, the journal entry. Remember, you had to write that again. This is the 10th week. Then we had 2 weeks left. Okay. So, what is the importance of the threshold? Right, this passage, the threshold in the city, but also in general, in the world, in the self, the other, right? I mean, there is always a threshold. We always find, in a sense, ourselves at a threshold. And then also, what is this heterotopia? This concept that maybe I should introduce immediately, because we will see this in Foucault, in other spaces, right? In Stavridis as well, and it is the threshold. We will see, okay, in a moment what this is. But in addition to heterotopia, threshold, which is perhaps the central concept for today, a theme, problem that you had to think about, write about. Then we will also see, similar to this, the border, the idea of the border, right, crossing the border and so on. and the question of identity, which is important in Stavridis, important in general, identity, and think about that. I mean, the identity and therefore difference as well, right? I mean, identity in relation to the self, but also in relation of so many other right categories, like whatever, national identity, religious identity, and so on and so forth. How does one arrive at an idea even of identity, let alone a reality, the reality of identity, right? The question of the self and the other, the relationship, right, between these two things, or more than two. Often, the question of again the border, the limits, right, between these two things or any other, two things, the limit and therefore the threshold, the passage, as you will see in Stavridis, he often speaks about this beautiful idea, the idea of becoming other. What is it to become another, to become other? So these are the three concepts: threshold, border, identity, and then this fourth one related to all of them, heterotopia. Okay, let me say something about this. Hetero, from the Greek heteros, means other, right? And topia from topos, place, right? Other places, precisely, right? So that's what heterotopia is, which is, as Foucault also says, maybe I call attention to it. It's on page 3 in your edition, right? Article of the Foucault essay on page 3. You will find I highlighted that for you, and this idea, the difference between utopia, we are more familiar with that word. You, the prefix you would be a negation, right? And topos, again, place, no place. By a utopia, as we know, is this ideal place, this place that doesn't really exist, right? That it is nowhere to be found. That's utopia, typically in the tradition, right? And we also get the word, of course, dystopia. Dystopia is a bad place, so to speak, right? We might say that today, and I leave that to you to think about, we are living in dystopic times. Dystopia is, I don't know what. Science fiction very often, I'm not a reader of science fiction, but very often describes, right? I mean, these dystopic moments, right? I mean, and then heterotopia, again, the other, other place, something that might be brought about, or that it is there actually already to begin with, and therefore the question of the threshold, the passage that we had to make into something different, new. And actually, let me begin because in relation to Foucault, right? I want to only touch on this one page, and then I read something from Stavridis. Maybe again, I don't want to be too long. We are getting closer to the end of the semester, like I said. Then we will finish this semester, week 11, week 12, right? Week 11 with the question of servitude and control again, and week 12 with the question of debt, DBT, and and then remember also that I have a schedule, right? This Zoom meeting for this Wednesday, right? Wednesday, what is it? For tomorrow at 7 p.m. Right? We had this Zoom meeting, which again is a way of right, so that we can basically see each other, speak to each other, touch base, so to speak, and it is like I like to say community, kind of a community meeting, right? It's not a class, but during that meeting, of course, you can ask questions, make comments. We will, okay, engage in some type of discussion in relation also to the class as a whole. Okay, so let me go to the Foucault briefly, and like I said, if you go to page 3. I mean, the whole essay is important, read it, okay? But on page 3, he says, right at the beginning of the second paragraph, first of all, utopias. We had the utopias, right? I spoke about that already. These are the utopias are arrangements which have no real space. Okay, they basically the topos, the place doesn't exist, the space. And then a few lines below, he says, in contrast to utopias, right? To the utopias, these places, which are the places, the other places, the other space, the other places of a heterotopia, which are absolutely other with respect to all the arrangements that they reflect and which they speak, might be described as heterotopias. Okay, that's what he says. Then he speaks about the mirror, very interesting, metaphor even that he uses, but it's also a reality. Think about the meaning of the mirror, right? Reflecting something, and also the not only the mirror, but think about the window pane, right? Whereby we can see through, and we see the other place. Okay, so he speaks about the mirror, and then he says at one point, highlighted for you, there I am down there, I am down there, where I am not. Right, I mean, in the mirror, right, I am not there, a sort of shadow that right makes my appearance visible to myself, the reflection allowing me to look at myself where I do not exist. I'm not there, right? I mean, and the photo as well, the picture today with the selfie kind of no modality and so on, utopia of the mirror. At the same time, so he's speaking in terms of utopia for now. So I'm not there in the mirror where I see myself, right? So the place doesn't exist. The mirror, the place is there, but I'm not there. At the same time, we are dealing with a heterotopia. Okay, so there is the utopian and heterotopian moment as well. The mirror really exists, right? I mean, I'm not there, but the space is there, the place, and has a kind of comeback effect on the place that I occupy. The reflection starting from it, in fact, I find myself absent from the place where I am, in that I see myself in there. And then I read just another a few more lines below. Okay, he says, hence the mirror functions as a heterotopia. Think about this. The mirror is a space other, which is, different from, since it's not a no place, the utopia, it is there, right? The space is there. Heterotopia, since it makes the place that I occupy, Foucault says, whenever I look at myself in the glass, both absolutely real, right? It is, in fact, linked to all surrounding space, and absolutely unreal. Okay, so that's the idea of the heterotopia in Foucault. But let me go briefly again to and we can touch on all the important points in Stavridis. I just want to maybe also give you some reference, some of the pages, right? I mean, in the introduction, especially, you will find, which is also, he gives, as often is the case, the introduction, a sense of what then takes place in the chapters. I think that I asked you to read, in particular, chapters 1, 3, 5, and 6, but especially 1 and 3, okay? So, but already in the introduction, page 13 and 15, and then from page 16 to 20, you had this thematization, very interesting. You find the themes, the concepts of, like I said, at the outset of the class today, of a threshold, then a border, and also identity. Then you had the question of the exception that becomes the rule. On page, for example, 31, 32, 33, 34, page 35, exception, rule, that comes back with the concept of that you will see on page at least 36, page 37, the red zones that today, right, with the pandemic, are also becoming not very important. It's a timely thing, actually, this of the city, especially the city of, towards the city of thresholds and the red zones and the exception that becomes the rule and the partitioning of everything. Think about the meaning of social distancing, as we say, in all types of situations. Now that the summer also is coming, right? I mean, in New York, they will open, right, the beaches, the parks, and so on and so forth. The beaches, certainly, right? And so there is still this idea of precisely, being 6 feet apart and so on and so forth. I mean, this is all part of uh, the understanding of right, the city in terms of one might say even at times dystopian, but certainly in problematic terms. And then he goes into this question of I'm just giving the reference again because I want to touch briefly on these points and then maybe I read something from the text. Okay, the idea of becoming other, right? The question of again there too there is a transition, the self, the other, becoming other, crossing the border even within of the self, the threshold, and page 39 and page 40 you will find a reference to this becoming other. Think about the meaning of this. And then the concept of traces, the trace, right, and thresholds on page 59, 60. Of course he makes reference to uh, thinkers. You will find that in his book, right, like Walter Benjamin and so on. But in any case, then the aura, which is AURA, which is part of the trace as well, and the threshold, which is a concept that comes from Walter Benjamin. This you will see there is a whole chapter on basically Walter Benjamin in Stavridis, so you can somehow become familiar with Benjamin as well as you read this chapter in the book by Stavridis. And Foucault, he also has a chapter on Foucault. Then the flaneur, you will see this. Or some pages where you can find this 62, 63, 65, and then also 66 and 67, where he also goes to the concept of the flaneur, which is a French right word, someone who walks and wanders kind of aimlessly especially in the city, a figure that becomes a character important in Walter Benjamin, and then Stavridis uses this as well to exemplify, right, the idea of the threshold, the passage, and so on. You will find that on page 63, 64, but also 67, like I said, and 65. And then glass. The question of glass, the mirror in Foucault, the glass on page 69, which is interesting because the glass, of course, the mirror is a type of glass, right? But the glass, even, the window pane, the right, the glass whereby you see through. It's not only the reflective, the reflection of the mirror, but the refraction as well, and so on. And then the concept of heterotopias, to say the least. I give you just one reference, page 112. Okay, but let me go back, read just a few things. Again, I don't want to be too long, also because, I think that the text, the reading is fascinating. I saw that some of you have already, just a couple perhaps of you already done the journal entry. Do so, the others as well. All of you should. And so on page 13, when you go to the Stavridis right text that you have on page 13, toward the certainly the second half, the final section of the page, the next to the last paragraph, he says This book's main argument, and this is important because it gives you the sense of what the book is about, is that in the creation and social use of thresholds, okay, thresholds are made, created, and they are used socially in the city, the urban context, right? Not only, but a potential speciality, space, potential space, new space can be produced, right? Over emancipation emerges, right? I mean, there is this emergence of new possible space, places, possible spaces, right? Social struggles, then he says, and movements are exposed to the formative potentialities of thresholds. What I want to call attention to, I mean, everything is important here, but there is this potential. The threshold is expansive, so to speak. The threshold is a door, a passage, a door into something which is different from what it was. But the threshold as such is the in between, even in terms of time, right? The past and the future, right? The past no longer, in the future, not yet, right? And whatever we call the present right now, the time of now, as Walter Benjamin says, that's the threshold, right? The passage, the door from the past into the future, and again, there is the in between, in dash between, right? And then Stavridis speaks of fragments, which is very important. You know, these fragments of a different life, which is the heterotopia, but also this fragments idea, this idea of fragments is important, right? Because there is this fragmentation very often that I leave that to you to think about that we experience, okay? And then otherness, he says a few lines below, is often, and so we already engaged with the question of the other, being other. Otherness is often experienced as the inhabiting. You find this toward the end, at the bottom of page 13. The inhabiting of right, the dwelling in of the in between, like I was saying. In between what? In between space and time. He uses the plural, spaces and times. This in between, which is precisely, I think, gives a sense of the threshold precisely in terms of both space and time, right? And otherness, because we become other as we do that, right? I mean, so that's the important idea. Then he goes into the question of art as well on page 14, and then there is this section called Beyond Borders. I spoke about borders already, the importance of that, and he quotes also Zimmer, a German sociologist, philosopher, who says that that man is the human being is not only a bordering creature but also the creature who has no border, and so the transition, the passage, the becoming other is always there. I mean, think about that in terms also whatever we understand as the self, right? And whatever we understand, probably wrongly, as the individual, is always in the process of making itself, right? Of individuation, right? And there is also this concept that we have not spoken about probably this semester, but trans, right? Trans individuality, trans individuation, whereby the process of becoming what one is never stops. Not only that, but in which we understand that the individual is a separate, and we saw that sovereign. We spoke about sovereignty. Reality doesn't exist. It is always this, kind of a common constitution of what then seems to be one, okay? One thing, one individual, one self, and so on and so forth. But there is always this constant stepping into the other space, the other time, if you will, the other self, the other community, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's the question of the border as well, and he says precisely that borders are also bridges. It is a bridge, not only separates in the sense of it's not a matter of a hostility, right? Right, that usually borders are understood as that, right? I mean, they define, and we spoke about this at the beginning of this class, sovereignty, the sovereign state, sovereign country, and so on and so forth, right? You had the border, and then, however, borders are also thresholds, bridges, right? I mean, so that's the important thing, okay? So the other is always already included. So, and that's the question of identity, which comes about already on page 15. Identity, which is a concept. Think about that. What is it to be identical? Identical with what, right? I mean, with oneself. But what is the self? Think about this idea. If the self is always in a dynamic, right, constant process of constitution, individuation, right? The self never stops changing, right? Whatever we understand as the self, right? I I do always something new. I change all the time at all levels, right? Biological level. We spoke about biopolitics too, but besides that, besides physically, mentally, psychologically, and so on and so forth, right? So there is always this uh, making dynamic process, making of one's identity, and of course there is always this necessary openness to the other. I mean, again, it's not only that the other is right, my brother, my friend, and so on and so forth, but I myself becoming constantly another. As you will see, that's the threshold, and that's the first highlighted, right, moment that you see on this page, still in the introduction, page 15. Identity in exile, right? It's interesting concept. Is open to otherness. It is forced to face otherness, but one might, also say that the condition of exile is more common than we might think. So in any case, he speaks about borderline identity on this same page, um, and at the end of page 15, he says that is why the identity of persons or peoples can be forced to change through changes, imposed on their spatial, temporal, space and time awareness. And we saw this already in, I believe, when we did no right, discipline and punish, those passages, the docile bodies, obedient bodies, if you remember from Foucault. In any case, there is so much that you can uh, read already here only in the introduction. Page 17 is also very important, and then there you have a section starting in the middle of page 17. The section itself is called approaching otherness, right? And then he speaks about on that page, page 18 actually, of the human ability, right? Toward the end of the page, at the bottom of the page, the human ability to become other. And then he says, being able precisely to become other, something that comes back also on page then 39, 40. I want to maybe skip some of these important moments and go there. But before doing that, on page 20, you have already the thematization of the question of heterotopias, right? And then you had the beginning of part 1, chapter 1, right? On page, in this chapter, you will see that he speaks of, first of all, there is a section beginning on page 31 called a state of exception, a state of exception becoming the rule. Now, we spoke about exception already in this class when we did, of course, Carl Schmitt, right? And then also with Agamben, go back to those videos, those classes as well. And but the exception that becomes the rule is very important. Think about this also in relation to the present global situation vis-a-vis the pandemic. What it is to think about something which is precisely the exception to the norm, to the rule that then very often becomes the rule. Okay, so in any case, you read this here. Actually, Stavridis refers back and, in a sense, corrects or qualifies something that Agamben, that we did last week, says, and that's very interesting, right? Because for him, this exception is precisely, the question of the threshold, right? He speaks about this on page 33. A mechanism, he says on page 34, it is you have a section called exception versus thresholds, right? And speaking about the camp that we saw already with Agamben, he says that the camp is a permanent spatial arrangement, right? The camp, he says, is not a threshold state, it is a space of a normalized exception. Okay, so that's basically the idea. And so see what you can make of this, and he speaks about the refugee immigrant and the immigrant detention centers, right? This is on page 36, which is also very interesting, and he goes back to the camp and the enclave. He speaks about the enclave in chapter 1 as well in very interesting ways. You will find that the camp is a model of an enclave of a normalized exception, and then it is here, this is page 36, that he begins already speaking about I mentioned before, the red zones, when this is how he says red zones become normal. Checkpoints, he says, and surveillance systems, we spoke about surveillance, right, in shops can become normal. Body searches, right, even at athletic events and so on can become normal. So that's the normalization of the exception. He says, I'm reading again, it is in this direction that the state of exception is generalized and becomes a rule. Okay, so see what you can make of this, especially in the age, right, we saw this last time, and we will see this again, of digital, right? Technology, digital surveillance, and so on. And then he has a section on page 37 called Red Zones as Normalizing Exceptions and the City of Thresholds. Again, we can't, again, I had to start actually wrapping up, but there are so many other important things that I mentioned. In any case, that's why at the beginning I gave you the reference, the pages, so you can use that to go get by, in the book, in the chapters on page 40. In any case, there is something that maybe I want to read as well, right? He says to be able to become other. We saw this already, right? Becoming other, right? To be able to become other, to be able to be in someone else's place. It is here that the power of inhabiting thresholds in between, between space time lies. Okay, so the ability to dwell in those in between right zones of indistinction, to be able to experience a change in identity, to be able to rehearse, test, check, and visit otherness means, right, he says, potentially to acquire the power to negotiate with otherness, right? This is important at the interpersonal level, the level of the political, but also ethical level, right? I mean, to be able to be in the place of another, and let's put it this way, simply, simplistically, maybe to see things from another person's perspective, point of view. That's, from the ethical as well as political point of view, very important, right? I mean, it certainly, again, just to say that, helps us keep an open mind, and that maybe our views, our positions may, be wrong altogether, or may certainly have a relative value, right? I mean, so in any case, chapter 3 is on, I mentioned that before, do the reading 1, 3, 5, 6, especially 1 and 3 in terms of chapters. And this one is on Walter Benjamin, right? That's the title of chapter 3, Walter Benjamin's Thresholds. Okay, so we saw the reference to Agamben, Foucault, now Walter Benjamin, that we haven't studied in this class. Maybe I mentioned him before, certainly when we did Foucault. I'm sorry, when we did Agamben, in those in between segments in the book that we saw, right? He has chapters, and then he has these segments, these sections that are called precisely thresholds. And one is, if you recall, on Benjamin and his right critique of violence. In any case, so I leave this to you to link then all these things together, right? I mean, one way or the other in your written assignment. Traces. The first section of this chapter 3 is traces, the concept of trace. Think about it, it's very, beautiful, evocative, right? Very suggestive, and individuality, right? So that's, and then he goes again into the question of the in between, and the question of time, that I mentioned before, the passage from the no longer, the past, to the not yet, the future, and the question of trace is, uh, important in this section, and aura. I mentioned the word, right? At the end of bottom of page 62, you will find this word, right, which is very important in Walter Benjamin's work, aura. And then he says that's the last, on the last line, right, of page 62, traces thus become vehicles of aura. Okay, so this aura, which is, a kind of something which is around, especially for Benjamin, the work of art, but it can be understood in more general terms, and there are these traces, right? And okay, so he elaborates on this. Then the flaneur, a figure on page 63. Um, uh, the flaneur as the opposite of the private individual. In the pages, above, you will see he criticizes the concept of the individual in a way that we had done as well, right? I mean, the concept of the independent, sovereign individual, I do as I please in my life, and so on and so forth. Fictional figure, fictional concept, false, right? Although very common and widespread as a concept, people usually accept it as such, right? But the flaneur, he says, is in many ways the opposite of the private individual. The flaneur lives, I'm reading, in a public space. Again, this, aimless, if you will, even wandering, going from place to place in the city. I mean, which is a very important, interesting activity at many levels. If you think of it, to visit a new city, for example, and just to go around and see things, right? whatever happens, and so it is actually the situation in which you had these traces, right, and these fragments that we saw at the beginning, and these traces of aura here and there, and this atmosphere, if you will, and the opposite of the private, independent, sovereign individual, and therefore this kind of, I used the concept before, this trans individual reality, right? A reality made of many, many different, right? Elements, situations, fragments. If I may, if I can make this clear, I like the concept of a trans individual, trans dash individual, whereby whatever we usually understand as an individual, I mean, an individual, but I'm made by so many different things. All the relationships that I have had in my life, that I have now, the people I know, the things I do, all the different aspects of my life, and so on and so forth. Okay? So, in any case, this then is the figure of the flaneur, the wanderer, in the city, in the public space, and the creation potentially of other space, heterotopia, right? And then he goes into also the question of the the glass soon, okay? But I hope that I gave you a sense of this. Then there is on page 67 the idea of again a study of thresholds. He goes back to trace and aura that oppose each other. He says, and the passage, the threshold, and the glass. Page 69. Glass, he says, indeed exposes, right? Bringing the interior very close to the exterior. Think about the reality and the function of glass. So this is very interesting, right? So he elaborates a little on this question of glass, this allegorical, he says, allegorical threshold, okay? That has to do with both what is far and what is near. Distance and nearness, right, are brought together in the reality of the glass in very interesting ways. Okay, so I hope I gave you some ideas. Then I just want to touch on and then finish there, but I skip quite a few sections on page 112. Then you have at least one mention of, then he goes into this question of heterotopia. That's the chapter, right? That chapter 6, right? I believe. Chapter 6, right? Where he speaks about heterotopias, precisely Foucault, Michel Foucault. Okay, we saw that, we started with that today as well, with the essay by Foucault. And on page 112, Stavridis says heterotopian conditions emerge, again in this context, right? I mean, the context that we have already seen in Foucault as well. So not as places of otherness, but as a passage, right? A threshold, a passage towards otherness. Okay, so that's the interesting thing. The heterotopia is not stepping, completely moving into something completely different, but it is the passage itself. The passage toward, that's the title of the book, right? Towards the city of thresholds. And, I probably close here. I hope I gave you a sense of this fascinating, right? Text, the book by the chapters we saw by Stavridis, the text by Foucault as well, this concept of a heterotopia that maybe probably for many of you is completely new, and also the very important concept of a threshold, the passage, the transition, the door, the border, and the question of identity, the constitution of whatever we understand as identity, and the threshold, and let me close there. When we think about identity, we should always think of it in relation to difference. Identity is difference, difference is identity, or what really happens in the relationship between identity and difference is precisely this, always being in between at the threshold of something, always the passage. Okay, so in any case, I hope I see, I hope I will see many of you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Right, for the Zoom meeting, and then next week I'll do the next video, right, record a video for week 11 as well. Okay, once again, do the writing assignments, the journal entry. Okay, see you.